SEP FanFic Readings presents Measure of a Man by Days 22. Chapter 19. Wine and Whiskey. June 28, 2011. Tea. Hermione's current dilemma. Hibiscus tea, to be exact. The bold red liquid was vibrant and alive, though not a blend created from her garden. Hermione had purchased it from an herbal tea shop weeks ago after reading up on the health benefits. Narcissa had rejected it after one sip, finding it too sour despite the liberal use of honey. The aftertaste was slightly bitter, comparable to fresh cranberries, which she hated. The opportunity to try it for comparison and argument's sake had come and gone, until now. Hermione reached for it slowly, every move more tentative, more cautious than the last. She bit the inside of her lower lip in contemplation. Should she try it? It seemed silly to let it go to waste. Would she like it? Despite the lack of an established preference for preparation or taste, Hermione had that familiar inkling that today's tea would be made to her liking. That very thought caused a shaft of uneasiness to pierce her gut, hard. She pressed her mouth into a thin line. Equal parts concentration and irritation warred within her. But not anger. That had been burned away last night. Fire-scorched earth leaving nothing in its wake except fertile ground and clarity. There were still scars of fire and destruction. They would always remain, but life was preparing to take hold. It was time to begin anew. Hermione took her first step by picking up the cup. A combination of berries and an earthy scent she often smelled after picking flowers rose in a wispy curlicue of steam. She brought it to her lips but didn't drink. Not yet. Even with yesterday's reprieve, today's tea was a reminder of the pesky impediment that made planting difficult, Draco Malfoy. Or rather, the thoughts about him that floated through her subconscious last night after her talk with Daphne. Hermione had laid in bed, in a state of unfocused awareness, as sleep hadn't come easy. She tossed and turned for hours and hours, dropping into sleep and then immediately back out, falling in and out of thoughts too heavy to navigate while awake. There was much to ponder, and it was hard to do with emotions and adrenaline thrumming in her veins. Harder still to sort through it all with truths blurring her vision, and her own flaws circling back in on themselves. Round and round, the beginning chased the end, leaving Hermione stuck in a loop of her own creation. Kingsley's words were also there, laying new tracks, changing the course and closing the gap. Everything crumbled into separate piles, what she knew, what she'd learned, and what she was beginning to understand. But as suddenly as insight approached, her brain steamrolled past it. Unable to back up, it simply looped again, and again. It was exhausting. Hermione was tired of losing sleep due to her hyperactive brain, tired of turning it all over in her mind while working through each problem thoroughly. But she did it because she had to. She needed to. To plant something new, the soil had to be prepared, conditioned and tilled, the last of which required her to drag up anything under the surface and mix it in with fresh dirt. She had to combine the before and after, the old and the new, in order to create something rich enough to weather the season and provide the perfect palette for new growth. Part of that process involved swallowing a good deal of pride and finishing a half-started conversation. There was something humbling about being wrong, and Hermione understood that apologizing involved more than simply saying the right words. She should have to change her behavior and shift her perception to truly see things that had only been in her peripheral before, or things she ignored. She didn't know what that tea meant. Maybe it was his form of an apology. Maybe it was meaningless. Hermione took a slow, careful sip of the liquid. It was tart, like the lemons Malfoy enjoyed, strong, but rather than subject her to the full power of its bitterness, an undercurrent of ginger and nutmeg balanced out the taste. And it was sweetened with the right amount of honey. It was so good, very much so. She took her time and savored it, enjoying the complexity of the flavors, incapable of further analysis, not even when she finished. But that was because there were more pressing matters at hand. Steeling herself with unbridled nerve, Hermione set off to Malfoy's office. She worked out the logistics with each step, rearranging and organizing the exact words she needed to say in the right order. Her plan came to a halt when she spotted Scorpius in white and green striped pajamas, his hair ruffled from sleep. He stood in the hallway, stubbornly staring at the knob of his father's door. Judging by the way he tentatively raised his little fist and knocked, he hadn't been there very long. The sound was barely audible. He put his ear to the door, pressing his hand against the wood, and closing his eyes as if it would help him hear any movement on the other side of the locked door. His sigh was saturated with melancholy. Nothing. Hermione made her presence known as gently as possible, but he still jolted and turned all at once. When Scorpius saw her, he relaxed, then went back to listening for movement. She joined him, pressing her ear to the wood in solidarity. "I don't think he's in there." Scorpius made a small, stressed noise. His lip poked out in the kind of pout that made her feel completely helpless. But that didn't stop Hermione from kneeling in front of him and fixing his tousled hair with a few absent strokes of her fingers. It was near time for a trim. "Why are you awake so early?" The little boy sent a longing look at the door, jiggled the handle, then glanced back at her. "Okay, I'm going to talk to your father and we'll get this sorted today. I promise." Scorpius gave a lackluster nod. Hermione straightened, dusted off her jeans before offering him her hand and a reassuring smile. She might have been struggling with the last wisp of her own nerves and pride, but those vanished when Scorpius took her hand. There were certain things more enduring than promises, and more important than pride. And hers held her hand like a silent lifeline. It was a realization that should have prompted reflection, or brought more a jarring emotional response, but it felt normal. Right. As natural as breathing. A part of who she was intrinsically. It just existed. It just was. "Help me with breakfast?" Scorpius cast another look at the shut door, then lowered his eyes to the floor. Still frowning, Hermione thought he might decline to stay where she'd found him. But he signed his agreement and took her hand again, with a look that was as trusting as his hand was warm. "I know you're worried, but he'll be fine, okay?" Another glance back was all it took before Scorpius allowed her to lead him into the kitchen. He didn't let her hand go as they rounded the long table where the note he'd been missing yesterday waited for him today. Trepidation existed where none had been before, but Scorpius bravely picked it up and offered it to her. Hermione accepted it, heart stumbling along, but she didn't consider opening it until after casting a featherlight charm and lifting the visibly confused little boy up to the countertop. At first, Scorpius appeared deeply uncomfortable, knowing it wasn't the proper place to sit, but when Hermione reassured him that it was fine, just for now, he relaxed. Blue eyes turned expectant. Right. A lump formed in her throat upon opening the parchment, the memories of the last still fresh on her mind. This one was shorter. Hermione hated that she could tell Malfoy had taken the time to carefully place each of a few letters. 9 letters made up 2 words that conveyed a type of remorse not easily said. "Forgive me." Scorpius's initial shock quickly faded. His face was serious, mouth sliding into a confused frown that only deepened when Hermione returned the note. He stared at it, then at her, not knowing yet how to ask the question in the language he was most comfortable speaking. But Hermione spoke his silence fluently. "It means that he's sorry about forgetting your note yesterday." She weighted the murky topic as delicately as she could with her shifting perception. "Dads can and will make mistakes." Hermione wiggled her fingers in front of her chin to sign the final word as she spoke. "I make them all the time, and you will too." Mistakes were human. People were complex and imperfect. It doesn't mean he cares any less about you. It just means he's not perfect. Do you remember the sign for when you make a mistake? He made a small fist and rubbed in a circular motion over his chest. "Sorry." "That's correct." She smiled softly as she once again brushed the blonde fringe from his forehead. "It's not easy to say you're sorry, but your dad wrote this note to ask you to forgive him." Hermione showed him the sign for forgiveness once, then a second time, when Scorpius put down the note to mimic her movements. A small smile tilted his lips when he got it right. "You don't have to do anything right now, but maybe—" Scorpius signed the word again with more intent. He meant it. "Do you forgive him?" There was no hesitation in his response. Yes. And Hermione understood, in the moment they shared, that while she was teaching him a new language, he was doing the same for her. Children taught the most profound lessons in the simplest of ways: compassion, forgiveness, kindness. Hermione was proud of him and the progress he had made, but it made her wonder. "Are you ready to see your dad before breakfast?" He He shrugged shyly, resting his ear on his shoulder and dropping his gaze to the ground. She smiled. "Well, when you're ready, I can help you." Scorpius never responded, but she could tell that the seed had been planted before it was taking root. Narcissa hadn't had much of an appetite yesterday, so Hermione decided to prepare a nutrient-dense smoothie. When Scorpius asked for one to go with his breakfast, she agreed. She may have also done a light reading on vegetarianism in children, with regards to proper nutrition. Berries and pineapple she'd frozen, tangerines Scorpius insisted on peeling, fresh spinach she'd picked, and kale she purchased from the market, as well as a bit of honey to sweeten the mix-up with some juice and water. Hemp protein she hoped to hide in the mixture. Hermione brought the blender to life with the push of a button, and watched Scorpius's eyes widen. His bare feet were dangling before he rubbed one against the other. With a wave of her wand, she summoned a pair of slippers for him that he put on eagerly. "Better?" Scorpius nodded appreciatively. After everything was blended, Hermione made a glass for Narcissa and put it under a stasis charm. It would be another hour before she roused. The second glass she gave to the curious little boy, eagerly waiting for a verdict as he eyed the metal straw. His first sip lasted longer than usual, and she dipped her head to catch his attention. "You like it?" He bobbed his head up and down, mouth still around the straw, cheeks dimpling. Scorpius finished his smoothie while she mixed what was needed to make an eggy bread for both of them. When his plate was made, he sat there with an expectant look before peering down. Oh, right. Hermione helped him down and whispered a sticking charm that made it easier for him to get onto the stool. Breakfast was served with little fanfare, but not before Hermione cut his eggy bread into bite-sized pieces. She sat on the stool next to him, with her own smoothie and plate, and watched him enjoy his food with perfect table manners. Zippy appeared not long after he finished to dress Scorpius for classes. When he tried to help her clear the dishes, Hermione stopped him with a gentle look, taking a knee in front of the little boy. "I'll be back in time for you to draw with Albus." Scorpius's face lit up. "He missed you yesterday." His mouth formed a little O, and a worry etched itself on his brow. He signed one word, "Sorry." "Oh, no, you were sad yesterday, and that's okay. Albus understood. Why don't you draw him something to make him laugh? What about a chicken?" When Scorpius giggled and didn't cover his face, all Hermione could do was watch him with a heart so full it rendered her speechless. Some things in life were definitely more important than her ego. Narcissa was in a better mood. It was day 2 of no Lucius, but there was an emanation about her today, a strange sense of serenity that permeated the atmosphere. A ceasefire had been declared in Narcissa's war against herself, Hermione, and every one of her personal demons. From what she learned about strategy, even more so in the time as Narcissa's healer, a ceasefire didn't mean that Hermione could let her guard down, or that everything just stopped. It was a new beginning to the journey of finding a permanent settlement, the best time to approach failed topics to determine if an agreement could be made and a real peace could be reached. Namely, additional help. Muggle help. Hermione had to be careful. Her prior attempt had been a massive failure. The first course of action was to gather the support of those closest to her, but with her conversation with Malfoy looming, she turned to the 2 others, Keating and Sax. In the spirit of over-planning, Hermione set a time and prepared a detailed argument in the form of a presentation. One she never ended up orating because, to her eternal surprise, both women had agreed to help almost immediately. Now it was time for the hard part. After a subtle, encouraging nod from Sax, Hermione took a deep, steadying breath. She was prepared to make her first move. It was direct, not disguised in cunning. Narcissa would see through anything that wasn't straightforward. "You've shown very few signs of true decline, and your results have been rather stable lately. I think it's time we should at least discuss the possibility of consulting a specialist to incorporate Muggle medicine and therapy into your care plan." Narcissa's mood evaporated into mist. "No." Hermione took a mental step back and veered in a different direction. "I don't understand why you're so stubborn about this matter. Wizarding methods are clearly working." Narcissa sipped her smoothie as stately as she could, which was quite the feat. "I see no need to alter anything." "They are working because I've consulted the best and created a plan for your care that was based on theirs. However, there are gaps in care that only a Muggle specialist can close. Certain Muggle medications have been proven to help. Your disease isn't one I specialize in, and while I've done exhaustive research and learned—" "No!" There was a finality in her curt response, an edge that threatened to slice if Hermione dared to press any further. Your methods are working, Miss Granger. Do the job I have hired you to do. Hermione, of course, wasn't done arguing. I could do it much better if you let me fully exhaust my options and allowed me to bring someone in that will assist. You could at least consider a consultation, Sax suggested with a touch fair lighter than Hermione would ever use. Nothing more. Narcissa gave them both a visible final warning that stopped Hermione from voicing anything else, no matter how sound and reasonable. She could only hope for something to have stuck with Narcissa. Hermione, being a professional at knowing when to charge or retreat, did the latter and gave Sax the quiet direction to do the same. Are you feeling up to your plans for the day? Sax expertly changed the subject. I am. Narcissa's careful response was followed by a moment of silence. I have marriage meetings to reschedule for Draco as his suddenly rigorous work schedule has made him unavailable. I also... Narcissa froze, blinking rapidly, eyes moving from side to side in evident and growing unease as she tried to scan her own thoughts. Whatever was on the tip of her tongue was gone, forgotten. When Narcissa became visibly disturbed, Hermione rested a gentle hand on her shoulder, shifting her focus from what was gone back to her. It took nearly half an hour to reorient her patient before Hermione's efforts finally took hold and she began to settle. The tension slowly seeped from her body. What is it, Miss Granger? Hermione and Sax exchanged looks, silently agreeing it was better if neither reminded her of what she'd forgotten. You just had a bit of dust right there. I've gotten it. I believe we were discussing your plan for the day. Yes. Quick on the uptake, Sax further distracted Narcissa from her moment, while Hermione ran another round of diagnostic charms in search of a trend. Mrs. Malfoy has to make an appearance at the Blishwick tea hour. She also had a robe fitting for the next weekend's society event. I suppose we should hurry along. Narcissa rose to her feet slowly, her peach robes highlighting a tinge of healthy color on her cheeks. If there is nothing further, I need to prepare. Hermione waited until they left before reviewing the results. There was nothing particularly alarming about them. After preparing a simple lunch, she headed to the ministry for a meeting of her own. She attempted to blend into the crowd, but received far more of her fair share of glances from employees in the atrium. It came with the territory. Rumors were spreading like wildfire. Hermione ignored the looks and stood in the queue for the lift. Everything was fine until someone not only stepped too close for her comfort, but also too close for the contact to be accidental. Cormac. Must we do this again? Boredom leaked from every word. Surely you must have better ways to use your time. Today my presence is merely coincidental. It didn't sound like a lie, but it felt like one. After your show in front of the Wizengamot, my uncle has no further interest in recruiting you to return to the ministry. He doesn't believe he can control you the way he would like. The statement was unexpected but easily forgettable. The edge in his temperament, however, was not. Cormac still appeared just as smug as usual, but there were universal signs of stress in his body language. It made her wonder just how things at the top were beginning to unravel. Were they at the point of no return? I'm glad everyone knows how serious I am. Yes, your threats, not threats, Hermione corrected sharply without rancor. I wouldn't waste my time or breath threatening. They moved up in the queue. Only 4 people stood between her and the lifts. I do, however, make promises that I intend to keep, either directly or indirectly. Cormac's smug expression faded slightly before it returned with new vigor. Such a waste. His voice made her skin crawl. Defending Draco Malfoy of all people. Your threat left us in a predicament that has brought a lot of unwanted attention and criticism to the ministry. Both of which are much earned by the carelessness and arrogance of your uncle, the minister, and all of those who support his leadership and benefit from his corruption. As for Draco, I did what was right, and I would do it again. Their argument aside, Hermione had no regrets about her actions that night in front of the Wizengamot. She could compartmentalize her feelings and separate the Draco Malfoy she defended from the man who, if he didn't give her the cactus back, would need defending from her. Such conviction, Cormac hissed. His breath was hot in her ear. It very nearly tickled, like a flying bug. She killed it by stepping back and giving him a look that could easily be classified as disgust, even by someone as willfully ignorant as him. He smirked, not letting it deter him one bit. There's a ferociousness in you that I'd never seen until that night. I'd admire it, if only you were that ferocious in other ways. The lift arrived and they filed on. Her hopes of slipping off unnoticed evaporated when she found herself alone with him after everyone else cleared out at the first stop on level 7. Cormac wasted no time returning to both their conversation and Hermione's side. He used his body to crowd her into a corner, but she was more than willing to fight her way out of it if provoked. "Your cologne smells like burning rubbish." "Don't lie." Cormac loomed even closer. "You love it." Space. Hermione needed it. As if granting a wish, the lift abruptly changed directions, which made him stumble backwards, and allowed her to regain her footing enough to position herself with her back to the door. Cormac was only marginally deterred, but remained in the center of the lift. "Why would someone like you threaten the Wizengamot to defend the ex-Death Eater? It's something I've thought about, something I find myself very curious about." "There's nothing to think about." Cormac shook his head. "I know what nothing looks like, and as a nephew of the Chief Warlock, I would worry more about your own safety than something that's none of your concern. They didn't give up the prisoners, so it's only a matter of time before Death Eaters retaliate." The doors opened on level 6, and no one was there. Hermione could have gotten off to wait for the next lift, but she didn't want to chance Cormac following her. She swallowed hard as the door slid shut. "So, no one told you the details of the security breach on Sunday?" "I have no reason to know, as I am not an employee of the Ministry. Speaking from one person who has been targeted for years by Death Eaters, you should worry about yourself." The smile on his face turned rakish. "Do you care about my safety, Hermione?" She didn't dignify that with a response. "I have Aurors watching my home and my person. From what I hear, you could use the same. I could make that happen for you. I could even protect you myself." His blatant visual perusal of her body was revolting. "It's a job I would gladly volunteer for." "You? Protect me?" Hermione snorted incredulously. "Hardly." The doors to the lift opened on level 5, her stop. Cormac didn't follow her, but before the doors shut, she heard his final words. "Until next time." It took the entire walk to her destination for Hermione to shake off the stench of Cormac's words, and his cologne. When she arrived, the door was open and Percy was waiting inside. His office was clean in a clinical sense that was fitting to his character, but also cluttered in a way that it wasn't. Stacks of parchment rolls and books were ordered neatly on the side of his desk, while large piles of file folders and papers littered the other half. The sight was jarring. Not because of the disorder that bordered on too much for Hermione, but because Percy was calmly seated in front of the chaos on his desk. "Why didn't you access my office through the flue?" Percy stood to greet her, dressed like the epitome of composure that he was. "I didn't want to be accused of sneaking around the Ministry, so I took the public entrance." "Fair." Percy waved the door shut behind her. "Any eyes on you?" "A few." Hermione took the seat next to his and crossed her legs, declining the peppermint candy he silently offered with a wave of her hand. "I saw Cormac in the atrium. He seemed a bit out of sorts." "Ah, so they'll know you've come here. I have to remind myself to sweep the office for foreign charms and objects in the morning," Percy said flippantly as discussing the weather. "Tiberius' paranoia increases every day, especially after Sunday's security breach. I imagine that's why Cormac is stressed." He mentioned the breach in the lift, but was surprised I didn't know about it. "Which breach? There were 2, actually. At the same time, no less." Percy noticed her expression and offered the explanation she sought. "I'm not certain why you would know about them. The first we were notified of involved the remaining members of the Wizengamot and their families, his included. Their ministry files were compromised during the chaos that ensued after the initial breach, which involved someone attempting to release an unknown powder into the air in the atrium." "Unknown?" Hermione's eyes narrowed. "Was it ever identified?" "Harry and Draco's interrogation yielded quicker results than the poisoning team's test. It took most of the night for them to get it out of the prisoner, but it's very much the same poison you're thinking of. The one you've seen." Percy stood up. "It appears they've managed to successfully alter it from a liquid to a powder. No doubt with the help of the kidnapped potioneer. Test shows that it's not as potent, but still dangerous." Years of threats and laced letters had now been broadsided by a larger one that only needed an open space and intent. One spell could send powdered poison in all directions, infecting everything and everyone within its reach. The magnitude of the possibilities was chilling. What was worse was the fact that Due to the Ministry's prior inaction, they were already behind, which gave the Death Eaters more time and access to their captured potioneer for any further tweaks. What is Tiberius doing about this? He put it all on Hestia, and by extension Draco and Harry. At least he's throwing resources at the problem, no matter how selfish the motivation. Because he was now at a greater risk of being infected. Hestia reached out to Theo, who formed a permanent team in poisonings to assist. The only issue the DMLE has now is staffing. The Coalition has sent over Aurors to assist, but they have to train everyone. At least she knew why Malfoy hadn't been around. Okay, so why would they choose Sunday? There's hardly anyone here. Practice. Percy gave her a meaningful look. At least that's my hypothesis. Theo is leading the push for the antidote's mass production. He has a small team working to alter the potion enough for it to be taken before infection rather than after. That was something Hermione hadn't known, but not surprising. Theo tended to be several steps ahead of everyone. The powers that be are going to be interested in assisting his efforts. Of course they are, now that they're in danger. Conversation lulled, but not for long. Percy checked his watch and straightened his tie, while Hermione watched him with growing curiosity. She was mere moments from vocalizing her thoughts when he broke the silence. Due to recent events, we've rescheduled tonight's meeting. Meeting? Oh. Oh? It wasn't on her Magi schedule, and therefore not on her mind. Malfoy hadn't told her about it the night of the solstice, but the details had been lost to the evening. Hermione ran a hand through her hair. Just let me know when and if I can do anything in the meantime. Your appearance was recruitment enough. People are interested and ready to fight. Good to hear. I don't want you to exert yourself, Hermione, nor do I want you to become the face of a movement you never intended to join. You have enough going on as it is. He wasn't wrong, but that didn't negate her willingness to be of assistance. I could take on a very small task, but I don't think there are any small tasks involved in overthrowing corruption. Percy laughed. Likely no. To be honest, I may need one thing from you. It's not something you have to do right this instant, either, but... Kingsley? Hermione was astute enough to figure out that piece of the puzzle. You want me to try to change his mind? It was a very tall order. From our talk recently, he seems to be erring on the side of acting as an advisor to whoever will take over. But he did say that he would consider my proposal should I present it. At least the door is open for that. What are you going to say to him? I'll need time to think about it. She wouldn't step a toe in that direction without a solid plan. Anything else? How is your interpretation of Malfoy's translation going? It's... Percy chose his words carefully. Slowly. Oh? As you know, Draco has been translating the old magical law texts, and I've been interpreting those texts. But that takes time. At the rate he's going, myself and the small team I've assembled won't have it done in time for it to be effective. Malfoy was only going that fast because he was sacrificing sleep, but Hermione kept that to herself. She had little room to judge. Tiberius is erratic at best. The louder the noise, the harder he tries to drown it out. Right now, he's turned his attention to the Diagon Alley tenants. They're starting to push back and argue the legality of their leases. I'm also recruiting, and people are beginning to turn to the Restoration. More and more officials are noticing his behavior. Unsurprising, really, as he's beginning to turn on all of them. So we're building evidence against him. It seems as though the walls are closing in on him. Hermione couldn't curb the bite in her tone, nor did she care. Good. They are, but I need to devote time to that fight. My magical law knowledge is a little rusty, but research is a specialty of mine, as you know. I can always find an answer, if needed. Hermione suddenly had the growing realization that he was trying to feel her out. About what? What aren't you asking me? She knew Percy well enough to point out that his shiftiness began around the talk of Malfoy and his translations. If you're going to try to assess my willingness to interpret Malfoy's translations, or work with him in any capacity, the better question is, would he want to work with me? He works alone, and he does, typically, but the election is being held next August, and the minister is already in the race for re-election, and campaigning. We're running out of time to expose them both and submit our own candidate. Draco is aware. Does he know you were planning to ask me? Hermione folded her arms. Yes, and he's already agreed. Before shock could spread across her face, there was a knock on the door. 2 rapid ones, a pause, then a single knock. Percy smirked and moved as he waved the door open. As it turned out, they both knew the visitor. Pansy. She looked extremely put out, which wasn't an unfamiliar expression, nor was it one that bothered Percy. In fact, his eyes brightened in that muted way of his, equal in meaning to the slight softening of her scowl when Percy greeted her by pressing a kiss to her knuckles. The scene provided more ammunition for Hermione to use, but judging from the daggers she had to quickly dodge, Pansy knew just that. Hermione's grin widened. "I'll leave you both to it." Hermione rose from her chair. "Percy, we'll speak on that request later. Oh, and Pansy, don't forget about girls' night on Friday. The conversation is sure to be illuminating." "Some days I loathe you." "Love you too." Hermione blew a kiss and left with a pep in her step. Even with no real destination in mind, Hermione gravitated towards the Auror's office. The closer she got, the more focused she became. Malfoy. Or rather, her need to lock down a meeting time, date, and location that worked with his busy schedule. By the time she greeted Dolores, Hermione had a clear mind and a course of action. She knew little about Malfoy's day, except that he and Harry had been working together a lot lately. All she had to do was find one to find the other, but Harry wasn't in his office. "He's in the training room briefing for the French Aurors, who have just arrived." She looked so excited. "It's so wonderful that they're getting what they need to deal with the Death Eaters once and for all." "Where's the training room located?" "Just down the hall," Dolores pointed. "The room is glass. You can't miss it." "Thank you." Hermione smiled graciously, but before she could leave, Dolores said something interesting. "If you're here for lunch, Malfoy's already eaten today. He and Mr. Malfoy had an early lunch together. There was yelling, but I think they were arguing about Quidditch." A peculiar development. "Oh?" She could hardly hide her surprise. "I never thought they would get on, but I'm not entirely certain they do. But it's far less tense around here than it was when Harry was first promoted. Perhaps they respect each other now. That goes a long way." True. Hermione mused on that as she walked to the training room. Dolores had been right. It was extremely easy to find. The glass wall gave her a view of Harry, who stood closest to the door like a casual observer. She also spotted Malfoy in his usual black, speaking to a captive audience of 20 or so unfamiliar witches and wizards, all seated in 4 lines with no aisles. Hermione couldn't hear what was being discussed. Despite the open door, the room was spelled for privacy, but she could see one of the witches in the front row now blushing and smiling prettily at Malfoy. How unprofessional. The far wall was lined with long rows of "Have You Seen This Wizard?" posters, featuring each known Death Eater, associates, members of their inner circle, and some other witches and wizards she didn't recognize. Their faces were twisted into deranged sneers, and their crimes were listed under their pictures in typeface too small for Hermione to make out from where she stood. A few of the photos had bold black X's, indicating either capture or death. In the center, between Rabaston and Amicus Caro, was Fenrir Greyback's likeness. He was the only photo not fighting against his chains or silently screaming and ranting. No, he was smiling, showing off his sharp teeth like a predator waiting for the chance to sink his teeth into prey. Greyback was nowhere near, but Hermione felt a familiar chill of fear curl in the pit of her stomach. She allowed herself to look, made herself look, just for a moment. Her fear passed like the retreating shadow of an eclipse. It would return. Until then, she scanned the rest of the room until her eyes fell on something familiar. Harry. He waved at her to come through the open glass door. For some reason, Hermione was nervous to enter. Jittery, even. She had never felt like this and couldn't understand why she did. Dismissing her nerves as ridiculousness, she shook her head and stepped into the room. Only then did she hear Malfoy speaking. Not that she understood what he was saying. It was in a different language altogether. French. Hermione intrinsically knew that he'd lived there for a decade, but it boggled her mind that not once had she considered that he spoke the language fluently. As she listened, the ridiculous part of her brain that recognized attraction lit up again, but Hermione's attempt to kill the zombie thought went awry, and now she had a problem. A growing irritant. Shite. Some interruption of Malfoy's monologue blessedly derailed her train of thought. A discussion broke out, and Harry tried to disguise that he was well out of his depth. But Hermione could spot the confusion from space. Clearly. She spoke enough to get around the streets of Paris like a tourist, only able to translate snatches of words here and there. Not that she was listening for content. She wasn't. If she were being honest with herself, she was only paying attention to the cadence of his voice. His French, to her inexperienced ears, was perfect and exact. Malfoy's British task force team rarely spoke to him long enough to ask questions, always deferring to Harry, But there was a familiarity in the French task force response to him. That was curious. The next question came from the blusher, which involved another response from Malfoy that made Hermione listen, if only to figure out if he was being as professional as he sounded, or if he was being an arse, or friendly. It was hard to tell because she couldn't see his face. Only his hands punctuated each point before returning to his sides. A habit from his mother's etiquette lessons he hadn't broken. "This is Malfoy's task force team from the French ministry." Hermione nearly jumped out of her skin, not realizing Harry was standing next to her. He didn't notice. "They've been assigned here as part of the coalition. Apparently they all volunteered. They seem to both like and respect him, which is bloody weird." She cocked a brow at him. "Says the person who had lunch with him today." "Says the person who has tea with him regularly." That could have taken a sharp turn had Ginny told him about the solstice, but she hadn't, so Hermione wisely let it go. "Before I forget, come out with us tonight." Hermione couldn't take her eyes off Malfoy. "For drinks, at the Leaky around 7. It's the usual group. Sorry for the late notice, but it was a last-minute decision. Are you free?" Hermione didn't have her magic schedule handy, so she couldn't be certain. But after finally looking at Harry and seeing the hopeful glint in his eyes, she figured she could shuffle some things around if need be. "Sure, I'll be there. How long until this wraps up?" "He's been at it." Harry checked his watch. "I think they're due for a break." Harry got Malfoy's attention by clearing his throat, loudly. It made him pause and turn, irritation all over his haughty, bespectacled face. Then Malfoy saw her. While his expression never changed, whatever he had been about to say remained trapped behind his pursed lips. "What is it, Potter?" "Let's take 15. You've been at it an hour." "Fine." Malfoy turned back to the group, who were eyeing her curiously, and addressed them in smooth French. Soon they were out of their seats, talking amongst themselves, several of them exiting past Hermione, likely in search of the loo. Malfoy turned back to them. "I'll stay while—" "Actually, I'd like to speak with you if I can." From the edge of her peripheral, Hermione registered her best friend's surprise, recoil, but she was far more focused on Malfoy, a single eyebrow raised over the frame of his glasses. "Me?" His mouth flattened to a thin line before he made a stiff gesture towards the glass door. "Very well. Lead the way, Granger." And she did, giving the still surprised Harry an apologetic look. There wasn't a place for them to speak close by, so Hermione set a privacy charm as soon as they exited the room and turned to face Malfoy. She glanced back to where Harry was speaking to the blusher, who obviously spoke enough English to hold a conversation. When the witch giggled at something Harry had said, Hermione rolled her eyes, and the rotation stopped when she realized Malfoy was waiting for her to begin, folding his arms and standing in a way that made him seem even taller. "What is it?" "You're not checking your scheduler, and since I was already here to meet with Percy, I thought I would come and schedule a meeting with you in person about my cactus." His expression tightened, and his brows furrowed as he considered her with a measure of scrutiny. "Let me make certain I'm correct." His tone was unamused as his expression. He tilted his head slightly. "You've taken it upon yourself to interrupt my briefing about a cactus that you are perfectly capable of retrieving." "Your office is locked in a way that's tied to the wards of your home. I can't enter even if I tried. Furthermore, you've already asked me not to enter your office if you aren't there, and I've respected your wishes thus far." A small twitch of his lips scored her a point, but Hermione didn't celebrate just yet. "Secondly, I didn't interrupt anything. Harry did by allowing them a break they obviously needed." Hermione kept her features and words as neutral as possible, her objective and reasons in the forefront of her mind. "Third, I'm not here to argue about—" "A leaning cactus you keep leaving in my home." "Yes." She mirrored his stance, feet apart, arms folded over her chest, her chin tilted up enough to meet his downcast eyes. "It might not mean much to you, but it's important to me, and to your son, who I know is important to you." "Don't use my son as a weapon against me." Malfoy's coldness rivaled the frigidity of an Arctic winter. It made Hermione bristle. "That's not at all my intention." Malfoy unfolded his arms and brought them to his side. "If that's all you want, excuse me." He attempted to smoothly pivot on his heel to leave. Without thinking, Hermione shot out a hand to stop him. To her surprise, it didn't take much effort. He glared at her hand on his arm, then at her, but she didn't retreat. She met his cutting stare without flinching. She wasn't afraid, only determined, and set in her reason for being here. "What do you want, Granger?" Malfoy asked through clenched teeth, stressing every relevant word as his right hand curled into a fist. "I haven't had enough sleep to—" "Neither have I, but another day can't pass without us finishing this conversation." She tightened her grip when he tried to tug away from her. "I need you to set a time and be there. Everything else can wait." "We have an audience." Hermione cut her eyes to the glass wall, and, okay, yes, they most definitely had an audience that was unabashedly watching, all curious, including Harry. Even though she knew she should have, Hermione didn't let go, armed with the knowledge that if she did, the conversation would be over and nothing would be accomplished. Scorpius is more important than the audience. She held her ground until she saw the shift, the flicker of change that made Hermione relax her grip. But it did little for the tension that had settled in her bones. The warmth that rose to her cheeks equally matched what she felt through his shirt and what she saw just a hint of on his neck. "Tonight at 9. Malfoy adjusted his glasses with his free hand. "I'm not available any earlier, but neither are you. Potter invited me to attend your little group outing." He sounded as if Harry had invited him to shovel dragon dung for charity. "I suppose we can discuss after." "Wait, excuse me?" Hermione had obviously underestimated the trajectory of the shift between the two men, because that was the very last thing she'd expected him to say. Of course, Malfoy had friends that would be in attendance as well, but not once had he ever turned up. "Harry invited you, and you actually planned to attend?" "Unfortunately." He huffed out his irritation. "Potter is persistent. Annoyingly so." His expression would have made her laugh, but the situation was too bizarre. What world was she living in? The pub was crowded for a Tuesday night, jovial and energetic. Hermione walked in with Ron, who had arrived at the same time and earned a few looks, but no more than usual. The regulars didn't care about the presence of war heroes and their friends, but the younger crowd ogled her and Ron hard, whispering amongst themselves. No doubt exaggerated rumors of their reconciliation would be featured in the gossip rags. She gave it a week before she would have to sic Parvati on them. The location of their table was ideal, in the back of the restaurant, warded for silence and privacy. When they approached, she and Ron parted ways to greet everyone. The first thing Hermione noticed was the lack of Malfoy. Ron grabbed his usual seat next to Harry, while Hermione took a little longer to sit, striking up a conversation with Blaise. Per the flu call she'd received before leaving her home, Padma wouldn't be joining them. She'd asked Hermione to tell her fiancé that she'd see him at home later. "What happened?" Hermione explained that Padma's afternoon had rapidly declined after the arrival of a new admission in the form of an unregistered newly bitten werewolf. He had tried to ingest a cure he'd bought from someone selling wares in Nocturne Alley that the Department of Magical Law Enforcement had been investigating. It ended up being a blend of ingredients, harmless to humans but poisonous to wolves, and had left him fighting for his life in St. Mungo's. "How did she sound?" Blaise's concern for his fiancée was far from subtle. "On a scale of 1 to 10. "Like talking to your mother tired." "Ah." He didn't wince, but Parvati and Ginny did, because they knew. Message relayed. Hermione took the empty seat located near the middle of the table, placing herself directly across from Pansy and another empty seat. Cho received a hissing glare when she tried to take it. Conversation was rapid fire, but with moments of lull. Chaos increased as they began switching seats to socialize with everyone. Susan left her seat next to Ron and went to chat with Cho. Ginny ended up in the empty seat next to Hermione, who had moved next to Blaise for a moment. The redhead greeted her with a hug before waving the barmaid over as best she could on a busy evening. "Daphne or Dean coming tonight?" "No, his mother is visiting," Hermione said. "I think they're going to watch a film." "Bold of anyone to assume either of them will make it through without leaving early." "Oh, they're watching it on the telly at home." Ginny's laughter rang out. "That sounds about right." The server came to the table soon after, in addition to Hermione's indulgent order of steak paired with a glass of Cabernet, because she'd earned it, or so Pansy said from across the table. Blaise put in an order of Padma's favorite meal on their menu for takeaway, chicken and leek pie, as she didn't eat red meat. For himself, Blaise ordered another whiskey, but it sounded as though he might be leaving early. "Who are we waiting on?" Susan asked cheerfully, face flushed as she drank from her own pint. "Weasley's brother." Pansy shrugged casually, as if she wasn't waiting for him. Susan gave her a look of disbelief that she pointedly ignored. "Luna and Longbottom are gone to Ireland for the holiday. Left by Portkey this morning. And Potter says that Draco agreed to come tonight. I'm curious about if he'll actually show." "He'd better." Harry sounded deadly serious. "Or else." Or else what? Hermione asked curiously. Oh, his smile widened. I just threatened him with my presence. Pansy's cackle rang out. You actually used that as a threat? Excellent! Why would you threaten him at all, Harry? Because to Hermione that was odd. Thought he could use a pub night out, he shrugged. He's working when I get there in the morning, and he's working after I leave. He's wound tighter than a... Malfoy's coming? Ron caught Blaze off before he could offer a colorful euphemism, rolling his eyes so hard his mouth half opened from the effort. Ugh, you lot aren't bad, but Malfoy? Kill me now. Pansy gave him a sharp look. I'm certain that can be arranged, if you'd like, Blaze finished with a pleasant smile that showed too many teeth to be sincere. Harry and Hermione exchanged looks with Ginny, then Theo, who tactfully removed himself from the equation by excusing himself to the bar, as they hadn't gotten Cho's drink correct. Smart. Was the act necessary? No, but Theo never wanted much to do with Ron's clashes with any of his friends, nor did he want to mediate anyone's interpersonal issues. He did enough of that while running the hospital. Keeping a handle on Ron's sharp tongue hadn't been her job in years, so he was well on his way to starting an argument when he was rendered silent by a well-timed silencing charm, delivered by the newest addition to the table, Percy. Good evening, everyone. He greeted the table in that reserved timbre of his, pocketing his wand in his navy suit. Ronald. Percy was all politeness when he patted his brother, who looked hilariously betrayed, on the shoulder. We mustn't forget to play well with others. It earned him a scowl. Harry patted his other shoulder in support, but didn't undo the charm. Not just yet. Blaze cleared his throat of the laugh that threatened to escape, and Pansy, well, she was blinking repeatedly at Percy, a light blush staining her cheeks. Then she scowled, probably to make a point to herself that she was actually in charge of her own actions. Oh, and completely unaffected. You're not very convincing. A tiny smile played on Hermione's lips. Pansy's glare could kill, but she was distracted when the barmaid brought their drinks. Hermione lifted hers first to Ginny, who accepted her own drink that Harry had passed to her, and clinked their glasses together. While Ginny and Parvati shared smiles, Hermione gave Pansy a knowing look. Percy sat beside her. You saved me a seat. Of course not. She rolled her eyes. The lie was so blatant Susan made a face. You hissed at me like a bloody cat when I tried to sit there. Cho, too. Percy brought his fist to his mouth and cleared his throat, looking extremely humored while Pansy leaned forward and threatened poor Susan's life with her glare. I did no such thing. Lies, Parvati added bluntly. Feel free to murder me with your eyes, but watch out for my face. It's my galleon maker. Harry scratched his head. I'm so lost right now. Cho took mercy on Ron and undid the silencing charm. Bloody hell! He turned to a sheepish Harry with a frown. Really? I had to get rescued by Cho bloody Chang when my best mate... Oi! Susan took Ron to task with a single look that made his eyes widen. Nobody wanted to be the focal point of her wrath. That's no way to talk about your savior. Thank you. Cho grinned fondly. Susan beamed. Sorry. Ron's ears tinted pink. For the record, there was no hissing, Pansy pointed out. Everyone looked at her with varying degrees of disbelief, which made her sulk. Percy leaned over and whispered something in her ear that made her pull back and catch his eye, one brow raised in a challenge. After flashing a roguish smirk, she playfully slapped his arm, but whatever he'd said lingered in her body language. She kept glancing in Percy's direction. A look passed between every witch at the table, even Cho. They had a topic for their next girls' night. Pansy looked vaguely horrified, but ready to fight them all off. Ginny smiled with all teeth. Excellent. Was that a fucking leer? Ron finally caught up. Are you flirting with Pansy? Bleeding? He cut himself off, looking vaguely horrified. For fuck's sake! Are you two... Are you actually blind? Parvati rolled her eyes. Of course they are. Is anyone else lost? Harry asked the table. Just smile and nod, Potter. Blaze sat back and enjoyed the chaos. Smile and nod. Hermione and Ginny burst out laughing when Harry did just that, slowly. By the time Theo returned from correcting Cho's drink, conversation had split up by sections of the table. Percy, Susan, Theo, and Cho began discussing work or something, which severely bored Pansy. Harry, Ron, and Blaze began arguing over Quidditch. Typical. Ginny joined in every now and then to either correct them, give her opinion, or agree with one of them, and not always her husband. Parvati ended up swapping chairs with Blaze so she could join in on the conversations she and Ginny were having with Pansy, who had quickly turned out the conversation next to her, but hadn't moved. She and Percy were likely holding hands under the table. Pansy and Parvati talked about fashion trends for the summer. Hermione and Ginny could not care less. She finished her glass of wine and received her second when the topic of conversation shifted. "How was your day, Hermione? You look a bit tired." "All right." She didn't tell Ginny that she hadn't slept great. That would only lead to more questions, and she hadn't had enough drinks to answer any of them. "You?" "Fine. Flu call with the kids. They're doing great. Albus said he was drawing with Scorpius and wanted ideas for pictures to send. I suggested a cow." They both chuckled. "I'm glad he's made a friend. Makes the separation easier for him." "I'm glad they both have each other." The drawing session had been a success, as Scorpius's walk around the garden while listening to Al's letter that floated next to him. "I'm thinking about sending Albus a sign language book. I'm teaching Scorpius, and I think he'd want to learn to communicate with him." "Oh, he most definitely would. Bill and Fleur could help. Fleur's been watching their art time and thinks their friendship is adorable." "It truly is." Hermione drank down a little of her wine. "How's the house hunt?" "We've narrowed it down to a few areas. Malfoy gave us the name of the muggle who sold him his house." Ginny laughed when Hermione blinked several times. "You heard that correctly." "My brain is trying to compute this, and—" "Well, look who decided to finally grace us with his presence." Pansy's announcement ended every conversation. Ron's face scrunched up, then tightened with pain. If she knew her friends, and she did, especially Harry, she would guess he'd stomped on Ron's foot to keep him from saying anything rude. "Apologies." Malfoy's voice made her straighten her spine, which irritated Hermione for a myriad of reasons she refused to identify. She didn't need to turn, but did so anyway. Gray eyes were on her like a brand before he looked away to address Pansy. "I was delayed at home." Hermione rubbed the twinge in her neck, then glanced back at Malfoy. He hadn't changed, but lost the tie and the jacket. His attire, stance, and look commanded every bit of attention he got. From Parvati, who ogled him without shame, Hermione heard a string of curses that sounded somewhat breathless. "Sweet Merlin, he wears glasses? Help!" Ginny rolled her eyes. "I can't stay, but as agreed upon, Potter," he glared at Harry, "I've made an appearance." "Your mother?" Harry's question had a level of understanding that piqued Hermione's curiosity. What had Malfoy told him about Narcissa's disease? Hermione hadn't said much of anything since agreeing to work with her. Malfoy's not-answer was all she needed to grab her beaded bag and stand up, digging around for galleons to pay for her food, but Pansy waved it off. "Go." "You can stay." He put his hands in his pockets. "She's fine now. Healer Keating is with her, and she's resting. Enjoy the rest of your evening." Then Malfoy left. Enjoy her evening? Like that was going to happen when she had a job to do. "I've got to go." Ron immediately protested. "But he just said—" "I'm aware, but she is my patient." To everyone else, she gave a short nod. "Sorry, everyone." Hermione left, catching more than her fair share of odd looks from Theo and Ron, and quick approving nods from both Harry and Pansy. She ignored everything in favor of following the tall, blond man's trek through the length of the pub, dodging happy and pissed patrons alike. By the time she tumbled out of the front entrance, Malfoy was passing the abandoned apothecary that had yet to be repaired. As for the rest of the businesses, Diagon Alley was alive and well thanks to added security measures. Hermione passed 2 Aurors on her brisk walk to catch up with Malfoy, nearly bumping into 3 wizards and a shop door that had swung out abruptly. When she called his name, he stopped long enough for her to reach him. "So what happened with Narcissa?" "She had an episode and accidentally apparated. She wasn't splinched when I found her, only confused. End of story. You're free to return to your evening." When Hermione didn't move, Malfoy's expression remained tight. I'd rather make sure myself." Hermione was a bit winded from her walk. "I'm your mother's main healer, regardless of your thoughts on my qualifications." His jaw twitched. It wasn't the best statement she could have made in the spirit of reconciliation and such. "Also, we are scheduled to continue our conversation soon anyway, so it's fine." Malfoy fixed her with a hard look that could have qualified as a scowl in a different light. Darkness had already fallen, and the glow from the streetlights was warm, casting shadows on them both. It made Malfoy look softer, less rigid. It was an illusion. "Since you're determined, how many have you had?" "What?" Drinks, Granger. How many? 2, she added quickly, and I don't see how that... Malfoy offered his arm. Oh, for side-along. It was oddly thoughtful, but the meaning diminished to nothing when he coupled the look of irritation on his stern face. Still, with tentative hesitation, Hermione stepped alongside him and slowly accepted his offered arm. She looked up at him, and had only a second to notice the signs of stress creased at the corners of his eyes before he pulled out his wand. They were gone with a pop. Malfoy waited by the bedroom door while Hermione reviewed Keating's diagnostic results on the now sleeping Narcissa. She ran a few of her own, focusing more on identifying a trend after an episode, and made a note to review each in the coming days. But all in all, minus very slight changes, Narcissa's results were the same as they had been that morning. No rhyme or reason for the episodes. Still, she had her concerns. The list of them continued to grow day by day. Things were fine, but Hermione was forward-thinking enough to wonder about a future when they wouldn't be. Until she could fully get Narcissa on board, Hermione did the best she could. It had to be enough. "What happened?" Hermione asked Keating in a low voice, glancing at Malfoy, who caught her eye from across the room. "I was given a very summarized version and have a feeling there's more to the story." "She had a sudden spell that didn't remember any of us, nor did she remember the date or the year. She was agitated and demanded we all get out. Draco was in his office working before he was set to leave when she spontaneously apparated. He left, found her, and brought her back here before going to find you." Hermione glanced at the impassive figure by the door. How had Malfoy known where to look for her? Perhaps there was a common place she sought out, maybe somewhere from her memories. Hermione brushed the thought away. Now wasn't the time to hypothesize. "Narcissa will be groggy in the morning. Any appointments she has, please see that they're cancelled or postponed." "I will." "Also, please monitor her hourly for the duration of the night." "She's had a few good days. I was beginning to think—" Keating looked down at the sleeping woman, and Hermione found herself intrigued. She hadn't considered her as someone who was fond of Narcissa, but somber was the only word to describe the expression on her face. It was interesting to witness another shift that had happened without her knowing. Her eyes fell on Malfoy again, and Hermione pretended not to notice that while he appeared supremely detached, he was listening. Why else would he stay? He could have easily waited for her in his office. So, through Keating, she spoke to him, and just as she was certain about the tea he made being perfect every time, Hermione was sure he would listen. "We have a long road ahead of us. Some months will be better than others. Some weeks will be harder. Some days will be absolutely brutal. We all need to work together if we're going to have any success. Keating, you've experienced this before." With Astoria, the words wouldn't form. "I have, but it doesn't make things any easier, Miss Granger." "No, it doesn't." If Keating said anything else, Hermione didn't hear. More than half of her attention was on the quiet man by the door. His back was to them both as he stood in front of the still-life painting of his mother that hung on the wall, one that would only come to life when hers has ended. Careful, almost reverent fingers grazed the bottom corner of the beautifully crafted frame, adjusting it slightly to make certain it was perfectly straight. An odd action from someone who didn't— "Miss Granger?" Keating's expression was one of worry. "Are you okay?" Malfoy's head slowly turned. "Perfectly fine." Her quick response caused Keating's eyebrow to knit together in suspicion and confusion. "In your report for this evening, please make certain to detail any odd behaviors that you noticed prior to the incident. Include every little thing you can remember, just for reference. I will have to schedule a call with Charles to discuss, so please be thorough." Before Keating could say anything else, Hermione left her to it, approaching her last task for the evening, the biggest one. Malfoy watched her approach with a guarded look, his body squared towards her with an airy severity. Rigid and alert, she felt herself tense more and more with each step. "Are you finished?" "Yes." "And my mother?" "Will be monitored all night, but she is fine as of right now." Malfoy made a polite gesture to the door, and she slowly bobbed her head in response. Words weren't needed. He proceeded to walk on to the exit ahead of her, opening the door that would lead them to the hall and holding it ajar. Hermione blinked. He blinked back. She shifted her weight from foot to foot. "I don't have all night, Granger." "Neither do I, but you don't have to open the door for me. I'm perfectly capable." "You're in my home. It's not unreasonable that I exhibit good manners." His voice lowered. "I can stop." Hermione blinked at him twice, ignoring the warm sensation crawling up her neck. Is that why you make me tea?" Malfoy didn't answer, not that she expected him to, but he gave her a long look from behind square frames. "I haven't had enough whiskey or sleep to deal with the fact that you are grating the hell out of my nerves tonight." She opened her mouth to retort, then changed her mind. "To be considerate, I can postpone this conversation until the morning. Let's just get this over with." But he didn't move, and neither did she. Well, until she realized that they would get nowhere until someone took the first step. So with a sigh, Hermione did just that. She found herself in the hall with Malfoy right behind her, shutting the door. From there, he led the way to his office. Hermione fell slightly out of step with him until they turned the corner. That was when he froze, staring at something Hermione couldn't see from her angle. She sidestepped him and spotted what had given him pause. Scorpius, with his blanket and pillow, was sleeping outside of Malfoy's office, and Hermione's heart hurt. She knew exactly why the little boy was there. The cactus. Malfoy sighed the sigh of a man too tired for words, and his shoulders slumped. Hermione almost said something, but he had locked his office with a flourish of his wand, and the door slowly creaked open. He stood over his son, mouth twisted downward in consternation. "Catherine said he's been outside my office all week." Good sense kept her from speaking, and patience kept her from moving. She wanted to see what he would do. Would Malfoy openly express the sentiments he kept so close? He glanced over at her for a long moment, then back at Scorpius. "If I ask you to leave, will you?" "Do you want me to?" Malfoy said nothing before crouching next to his sleeping son. Hermione watched with bated breath as he carefully brushed the sleep-tousled hair from Scorpius's forehead in a tender expression of affection. Then he scooped Scorpius up with careful ease he hadn't possessed the last time she'd seen him in this predicament. He'd gotten better. Malfoy rose to his full height, adjusting his son until his head was nestled in the crook of his neck. Scorpius's eyebrows knitted together as if trying to solve a problem a 5-year-old shouldn't have to deal with, and Hermione's heart gave a fond flutter at the little frown on his face, but he slept on. "His blanket and pillow. Can you pick them up? I'm taking him to bed." Without argument, Hermione picked up the blanket and followed Malfoy through the house, up the stairs, and into the first room on the right. She took in her first sight of Scorpius's bedroom in the dim light. It was everything a child's bedroom should be. Cool, comfortable, and tidy enough to match Scorpius's personality. But the room was sterile in an unsettling way. The bed, made of crafted wood, was in the center of the room, a focal point, but not one that was particularly memorable. She spotted multiple toy boxes lining the wall on the other side of the room, but they looked as though they hadn't been touched. Other than that, there was a small desk and a drawer set and a nightstand. It was very empty. Hermione placed the pillow on the bed and pulled back the covers before stepping back to watch Malfoy gingerly lay Scorpius down and cover him up. He gave off a groan from all the movement, but didn't fully wake. Malfoy wore his trademark frown, but it was softened by the dim light. He took a step back, preparing to turn to leave. Hermione did the same, but a soft noise from the bed made her stop and look. The initial sign of struggle drew Hermione in, tugging against her reluctance and propelling her towards a little boy. She returned to his side, taking a careful seat on the edge of his bed. "Good night." Her words were hushed as she smoothed the frown lines between his eyes with her thumb. "Let the stars light the way to where your dreams can be found awaiting for your arrival." It was something her father used to say to her at night. Over and over, Hermione repeated the affectionate motion. His breathing changed, deepening until she was certain Scorpius was fast asleep. Only when she stood did she realize that she was, and had been, under a gaze so heavy it felt like a physical touch. Hermione boldly returned Malfoy's stare, not knowing what was giving her the extra encouragement she needed not to look away. She caught sight of conflicting emotions as they flitted across features like a montage of images, flashing too quickly for her to properly identify. The moment continued until Scorpius shifted, his thumb finding his way to his mouth. A shaky chuckle escaped Hermione before she removed it slowly, giving his head a soft rub. "It'll mess with his teeth," she said by the way of explanation. "Which can be fixed with magic." Malfoy removed his glasses and tucked them into the pocket of his shirt. "If my memory serves me correct, isn't that how you fixed yours?" "Yes." Hermione lifted her eyes to him. "Are you ready?" "I am." There was a richness of his voice that she only noticed during quiet moments. "Would you like a drink?" "I don't drink whiskey," Hermione said with the memory of his bottle at the forefront of her mind. Of course you don't. Malfoy's response was matter-of-fact, like he'd known. Follow me. The silent journey led to the part of Malfoy's home Hermione had never seen. Down the stairs to the lower ground level, she caught a glimpse of the pool before Malfoy steered her in another direction. The wine cellar wasn't an actual cellar, but a room located under the staircase. The large room was well lit and had rows full of bottles stored behind protective glass. Hermione looked around, not even sure where to start. I had no idea Narcissa was a wine connoisseur. She isn't. Malfoy was behind her, close enough to touch, should she be so inclined. She felt herself tense at the mere thought, nerves trying to betray her cool exterior when he continued, My mother can't stand the taste. Then why bother collecting? I'm not an expert, but I imagine that at some point the wine will turn into nothing more than worthless glass bottles. I have several opinions on the matter, but my mother would say that the essence of collecting is to hold on to something for the purpose of experiencing it when it becomes more precious. Malfoy sidestepped her and walked farther into the narrow room, stopping to angle towards her. His gray eyes were probing before he returned his attention to his mother's collection, reaching out to touch the glass only to change his mind and pull his hands behind his back. What she won't tell you is that she collects wine with the knowledge that, as she grows older, so will her wine. Malfoy's eyes roamed over each bottle with mild interest. Even as she declines with disease, the contents of this room will remain, mocking time, something she cannot do. Hermione reflected on the heavy statement, allowing it to sink in, really letting it rest in her mind until she was ready to speak. Everything has a shelf life. Having a collection without eventually drinking it is like building a home and never living in it. Pick one. Won't you? She won't notice because she didn't curate this collection. Malfoy turned his back to her. When you're interested in something, you're more likely to pay attention to it. My mother hired Daphne to scour the globe and fill this room with vanity items. Ultimately, they're meaningless to her. They fell into a silence that might have been described as comfortable if it weren't for the strange feeling that the walls were sealing them into a room too small for them both. Choose. Though Hermione searched for something to catch her eye, she concluded that the task was impossible given the variety of choices. Chateaux, Contis, Cabernets, Madeiras, some of the wines were older than her parents. Other bottles were younger than her, but would age into their value. Each wine bottle was clean and perfectly placed. It looked like a museum. Do you drink wine, Malfoy? Hermione asked, eyeing a German wine whose name she didn't try to pronounce. Only when I'm inclined. You could choose a bottle for both of us. Or you could pick what you like. Malfoy turned around, studying her in a way that made Hermione shift uncomfortably from one foot to the other. Do you even know what you like, Granger? I suspect your taste depends on the occasion, the meal, the convenience, or the company you keep. He approached the glass door closest to him. With a wave of his hand, it slid open. Malfoy scanned the rows of razor-sharp focus before extracting a bottle. In the interest of time, the oldest bottle of Saturday will have to do. Hermione's journey ended where it had started that morning, Malfoy's office. Now, though, she was inside of it. Leaning against the shut door, she tracked his movements as he went about each task. Transfiguring one of his whiskey glasses into something suitable for wine, uncorking the bottle and letting it breathe. Hermione only looked away to take in the office she hadn't been inside of for a while, picking up all the small differences, even those that wouldn't be noticeable to anyone else. Children's books lined the bottom row of the bookcase, including a familiar plant book woven into the memory Hermione wouldn't soon forget. She continued scanning the room until her eyes fell on the cactus, which was in a place she hadn't expected. On Malfoy's desk, under a light. The bulb was bright enough to mimic sunlight, and the open book next to it displayed a larger version of the small plant on his desk. Hermione tore her eyes from the puzzling sight, allowing her focus to return to the most perplexing thing of all, Draco Malfoy. He was watching her quietly, steadily, lifting his brow before he went to his desk. He picked up the cactus, examining it as if it were runes on the bottom of the pot that could solve all of his problems. I'll confess I don't understand. The quality of Malfoy's voice was low and gravelly. He has toys he doesn't play with, books and all sorts of gifts he's received, but it's this that he cherishes above all. Sometimes we find similarities in unexpected things. Is that so? His expression was disarming, to say the least, like a first warning to keep her distance, but she was unable to stay away. Yes. Hermione joined him at his desk. She held her hand out for the plant that he gave her willingly. It's not always about material things, but the sentiment behind them. What sort of sentiment can be found in a cactus that doesn't even stand straight? Hope, strength, for Scorpius, companionship. She placed the plant on the desk. Al helps, but he's still lonely enough to find comfort in a cactus. Hermione felt a familiar stir of emotions that made her look away and down. You took that from him. Of course he's going to try and get it back. He's stubborn. He's your son, after all. For quite some time, Malfoy remained silent, pulling his glasses from his pocket and placing them on the desk as he circled it to shut the open book. In a quick display of wandless magic, he made a sharp gesture with his finger that pulled open the drawer in his desk. Another one lifted a bottle of whiskey from its depths, before resting it gently on top of his respectably cluttered desk. He poured her a glass of Saturday that hadn't breathed long enough, but she didn't care, swirling the contents before taking a much-needed sip. It wasn't at all what she expected. Instead of a bold or floral, the taste was modest, slightly nutty with a citrus quality she appreciated. Malfoy poured himself a finger of whiskey, drinking it quickly before tipping more into the glass. That time he didn't rush. Holding it to his lips, his eyes stayed on her. And? It's good. Excellent, even. Something she could drink simply because she wanted it. How did you know I'd like it? Lucky guess. I'm not that predictable. In some ways you are. He shrugged and took another sip. But in others you aren't. I have to say, yelling at me about abandoning Scorpius was quite the surprise. You attacked me at the core of who I am as a person. If you thought I wouldn't defend myself or air my own observations and grievances, you don't know me at all. I never said that I know you. I just said that you're predictable. That implies a level of knowledge that you've just stated you don't have. Malfoy didn't respond, and she wondered if she'd struck a nerve. He finished his drink and left the empty glass on the table. Hermione sat in the chair and observed the careful way he put the book about the cactus back in its spot on the shelf. His back was still to her when what sounded like reluctant words spilled from his lips. I'll confess, I overreacted about the plant. When she made an involuntary sarcastic noise, his neck snapped to her. Hermione avoided his glare by looking at the family portrait above the hearth and drinking more of her wine. I don't take chances with his safety. I know. After finishing her glass, Hermione leaned back in the chair. Nothing in or out without your knowledge. That extends to the rigorous checks that you perform on the people responsible for his care and education, and unnecessarily extended to me, as you know my history. In some ways, Draco Malfoy was part of it. Furthermore, he's not to go anywhere without security, someone you trust, or you. That's all correct. He pulled over the chair next to her to sit down. Do you know why? I have an idea. Hermione placed the empty glass on his desk. Daphne told me a bit, but not everything. She said it was up to you. Of course she did. Malfoy ran a hand through his hair. Harry receives threats every day, but his kids aren't isolated. They attend school and have the opportunities to make friends. Scorpius is different because he's my son. Malfoy's tone was as tense as his face. What my family did was seen as betrayal, and it carries a sentence my father has already served and we've avoided for years. Death. However, they are no longer interested in my mother. If they do succeed in killing me, it'll be a bonus. But Scorpius... A look passed between them. He is my reckoning. Malfoy folded his arms. Who is more dangerous? His unexpected question eclipsed the silence. A man with nothing to lose, or one with everything? That's easy. Hermione allowed her eyes to skim the rows of books in her line of sight. A man with nothing will go to greater extremes. The man with everything is blinded and logically inconsistent. Malfoy made a non-committal noise. I'd like to challenge your way of thinking. I don't expect anything less. Your answer is correct, but you don't account for the people and their circumstances. Or him. A quiet voice whispered, noting the fierceness in his voice. A man with nothing doesn't know what it's like to have everything. But someone who has everything and loses it, there's no one more dangerous or vengeful. Which are you? A sensation coursed through her veins. Are you a man with nothing or everything? Neither. Both. I have nothing for myself, but everything for him. The answer was so raw it evoked a swirl of mixed feelings in her, calling to mind so many responses that she thought it was wise if she said nothing. Hermione waited, swallowing each comment down until she was stuffed with the unspoken words, but she had to speak. You have Scorpius. You have your mother. You have your friends. You aren't a man with nothing, Malfoy. You're a man with everything who won't acknowledge it because the risk of losing it is more than you can bear. The heavy weight of his eyes made it hard to even look at him, but Hermione persisted with an ease that only came with understanding. Is that another reason why you've kept your distance from him? Malfoy drank another finger of whiskey. You're only as alone as you choose to be. Hermione would have seen the incremental shift in him even if she were blind. I suppose you would know, wouldn't you? He was right. Easy to admit that she saw a manifestation of it in the silence of a compassionate child. But how Hermione was faced with a bigger dilemma she could no longer ignore. She had to allow herself to see what she'd only heard about, and acknowledge that she had caught glimpses of in little moments over the course of days, weeks, and months. The loneliness in the man watching her, one that mirrored her own. Are you still lost? The question was out before she could stop herself, the echoes of a previous conversation still ringing in her head, not at all dulled by the wine. Are you? Hermione stared at him without answering, seeing the lies she told herself in his expression, her justifications in his antipathy, her excuses in his defensiveness. She felt loose from the wine and lack of food in her belly, honest and a bit raw from her introspection. Hermione waved her hand, poured herself another glass, and started sipping slowly. You know, she chuckled dryly, my objectives in coming here were Scorpius, my cactus, and to apologize for saying you'd abandoned him. And the rest? Malfoy's question was nearly a whisper. Outside of what I've already apologized for, I meant everything else I said. Silence returned like the deafening calm after the storm, but it didn't last. I suppose you're expecting an apology from me as well. I don't set the same expectations for you as I do for myself. That leads to disappointment. Hermione picked up her glass and approached the bookshelf right beside where he sat. She'd wondered if he'd read everything on his shelves. She ran her fingers along the spines until she stopped on a hardback that looked interesting. A classic. The Count of Monte Cristo. 2nd edition. Rare. It sat next to Tolkien. She studied the book to its right and left. Outside of the plant books, placed at the appropriate height for the reader. How Malfoy had organized his collection made little sense. That seemed to be a theme. Malfoy moved, and Hermione allowed herself to watch him stand up and approach the cactus again. For several minutes they silently focused on their tasks. Hermione sipped her wine and tried to understand the logic behind the arrangement of his books. Malfoy studied the cactus as if he were trying to unlock a code. I also meant what I said, except for certain unfortunate statements. While that was better than apology than Hermione expected, what happened next surprised every single expectation she didn't have. Malfoy talked. While it's my mother's role to control what Scorpius learns from his day-to-day activities, outside of that, each and every external factor of his safety is my responsibility. Obviously not one he took lightly, judging from the cadence of his words and the fierceness in each one. It is also something that I can control. I don't leave anything to chance and luck. That may work for you and Potter, but that does not work for me. Hermione touched the elegant spine of the picture of Dorian Gray, 1st edition. Priceless. It sat next to a biography. You can't control everything, but what you can, you will. She concluded after another sip. Lessen the variables and logistics to increase your control over the things you can. Am I right? She looked over her shoulder at the wizard who was leaning against his desk, holding the cactus in both hands. Malfoy nodded curtly. That logic was deeply appealing to the rational part of her brain, but it didn't work for the side that thought of Scorpius. That logic can be applied to everything, except people, especially your son. Malfoy frowned. I know the situation isn't ideal, but I do it for his safety. This way, I can focus solely on eliminating the Death Eaters without having to worry about them getting to him. After, I'll reevaluate. No, Hermione turned around. You can't keep him isolated until you eliminate the threat against him. It could take months, years. He's not a wall of books you haven't organized. He's a child. You can't put him to the side to deal with later. When he started to tense, Hermione took a breath to stifle her anger, then another. She finished her wine before speaking again. What I mean to say is that he's getting older. Each day he's changing. You don't know him, and the older he gets, the harder it'll be to find out because he's learning not to depend on you. And with his mother and grandmother. Hermione trailed off with some difficulty. Scorpius is your son. You can't continue to prioritize him incorrectly. By the time you're ready, it'll be too late. He'll resent you. If he doesn't already. His words were cold with bitter regret and brutal honesty. The simmering, self-righteous fire inside of her died. Malfoy, meanwhile, appeared angry for even saying it. He scrubbed a hand over his face. Twice. It wasn't her plan, but Hermione approached him before she could talk herself out of it. And now, as she stood in front of him, she didn't know what to say. Hermione ran her finger along the charmed spines of the cactus. Like trust, resentment isn't learned. It's earned through actions. You can control those. He's not old enough. My mother... For someone who pushes and challenges my thought process, you don't step out of the box that's been chosen for you. I won't presume to know how you were raised or understand the relationship between you and your parents. I'll only ask if you plan to raise Scorpius the same way. Her eyes made the journey to his. Are you going to make the same decisions that were made for you? Pick his life? Pick his wife? No, Malfoy recoiled. He will choose as he pleases. Then why does it matter if you wait until he's older to step in? It's just how it's been done. It's our way of doing things. He didn't know a different way. The fact that she didn't rant and rave about the pure-blood way felt like progress, but that had every bit to do with her conversation with Kingsley. Understanding his points provided a new perspective, which made her hope that one day Malfoy would be able to sort and pull and find a way of life that worked for him, too. One that was better for them both. I don't agree with how things are done, but I can respect it. However, at the same time, I feel it's your choice how you raise your son. Whether you get involved tomorrow or when it's deemed appropriate, you're going to help mold him into the man he'll become. What sort of man is that? Well, I can't say now, but you set the tone for behavior through how you treat him and others. Hermione found herself keenly aware of how close they were, how she had to lift her head slightly to bear the intensity of a direct look, but the cactus in his hand served as a point of reference, the only buffer between them. Your duty to Scorpius isn't just about his physical safety. It's about his emotional needs, too. You don't like leaving anything to chance, so you can't leave that to chance either. Her words were met with more of that complete and utter silence. And then came his defense, ready to challenge her. You're extremely opinionated about a child that isn't yours. Sometimes a good offense was an even better defense. Tonight hers would be honesty, both with herself and with Draco Malfoy. I care about him. I'm not ashamed of it. I'd apologize for intruding, but I'm not one to apologize for anything I'm not sorry for. And just like that, something in him leveled out, went silent, cooled. Malfoy cast a sidelong glance at her, then down, blinking several times. That time, his honesty wasn't so accidental. It was calculated. How did you... He cleared his throat. Catherine and my mother say he's taken a liking to you. Even between the lines, Hermione could read him clearly, understanding just a piece of him that made up the whole. Daphne's words were replaying over and over in her head. He didn't expect a second chance. Life rarely worked that way, but Draco Malfoy was just a person who had more losses than wins. A man who wanted what most people wanted, what she wanted herself, connection. Perhaps she could help him make the most important one of all, the one with his son. If you learn the language of his silence, he's not difficult to understand. Hermione lowered her eyes to the cactus. If you want to learn, I can teach you. If you want to understand, I can show you. Sign language? So he knew about that as well. Catherine really couldn't keep a secret. That too, if you'd like. Hermione allowed herself to relax and explain her bond with the boy more important than pride itself. Scorpius is as stubborn and prickly as the cactus he sees himself in, but he gets that from you. Malfoy narrowed his eyes, and she shrugged innocently, a familiar smile growing on her face. Why he likes me, I don't know. Perhaps it has to do with the fact that I'm dedicating time to show him something other than composure and rules. I talk and I pay attention to him. I give him a choice and a safe space. I show him the things I love and show interest in what he loves. I'm consistent and present. His eyes flickered away briefly, mouth tightening into a frown, but they returned and Hermione held on tight, unable to release him. There's nothing special you need to do, except stop being a ghost in his life. Reach out to him and he'll reach back. He watches you, not only out of fear and nerves, but because he wants to know you, just as badly as you want to know him. He keeps every note and tries to read them. He can't quite read them just yet, but I think when he can, he'll understand you better. Until then, you have to stop hiding and show him who you are. Malfoy appeared deep in thought, his face drawn in concentration. You'll have to earn it, but he's more than worth it. There's kindness in him. You sound surprised that he's capable of those characteristics. There was that defensiveness again, but Hermione was unbothered by it, because she'd expected it to rear its ugly head. Is it because he's my son that you're surprised he's inherited something other than hatred and prejudice? Neither of those are innate. They're learned. The fact that he's neither of those things speaks more to the person his mother was. Perhaps they speak more to who you are now, rather than who you were taught to be. Malfoy was midway through the act of handing her the cactus when he froze. His sleeve slid back just enough for Hermione to see the bottom of the dragon that coiled around his arm. His eyes were still on her, still full and searching, but she didn't look away. She held firm and let him look. She had nothing to hide. I know why you protect him, but there are better ways to do that than shielding him from both the world and yourself. I don't understand your need to do everything alone when you have people willing to help. Why don't you trust them? I only trust myself, and sometimes I'm even wrong there. His honesty had been coaxed out by the whiskey. This is less of a gamble than the alternative. Do you even believe that? Or is it something you tell yourself as an excuse? You let everyone in to a certain degree. Some more than others, but they all had their pieces to his puzzle. For pure necessity, and in some cases sentiment. Daphne. Funny, she never thought of Draco Malfoy as a sentimental man, but Hermione knew better than to comment. I hope you trust that I would never give Scorpius anything that would hurt him. You're too noble to hurt him. That has little to do with it. He's a child. He's innocent. Not to everyone. Malfoy's chuckle was rueful. To the Death Eaters, he's a means to my end. To everyone else, at the end of it all, no matter what good I do, he's still a Malfoy, and he's still my son. There are people out there who will judge him by that alone, who will hurt him for that as well. The sins of the father don't always pass to the son. Malfoy tensed, and Hermione watched his fingers trail down the spelled bristles as if testing the charm. Why does it lean when it appears to be healthy otherwise? If you must know, the reason I haven't given it back is because I was trying to straighten it, but no matter how much magic I use, it won't correct itself. Which was, well, Hermione wasn't exactly sure what to think about that. Because it's recovering, and things like that aren't instant. Water, sunlight, a proper home, patience, and time. It'll take everything aligning for nature to change its course, not magic. The same could be applied to Scorpius, and to him. He tilted his head slightly, frowning. Why did you give it to him? I didn't. Unconsciously, Hermione followed the expressions of his countenance. But I've realized the cactus is just as much his as it is mine. And you would just give it to him? The concept seemed foreign to Malfoy, who had figured out long ago that life was transactional, and some things came at a price he wasn't willing to pay. Why? He doesn't need your pity. Never pity. Then, kindness. Hermione covered his hands with hers, feeling his warmth on her palms. Whether or not you accept it or believe me, you deserve it too. Let kindness be the language of your heart. Alexandra Vasiliou.